In the late 90s, my life was defined by the silent call of the untamed wilderness. My grandfather was my absolute hero, a man who seemed more at home among the pines than in any office. To the world, he was just an average accountant, but to me, he was a giant in a white-collar shirt. Many of our family's happiest memories were forged during those long hunting trips across the rugged terrain. But time eventually took its toll on our family, and the vibrant days of our youth began to fade. Grandpa became a local character at my general store, spending his days greeting customers with a smile. During a weekend visit to his assisted living home, he seemed unusually energetic and full of life. My heart stopped when he revealed the truth about his health and an inoperable brain tumor. He spoke of his death with a calm that I found absolutely terrifying and confusing. His one final wish was to go on one last hunting trip to settle a score with the one that got away. The hike deep into the woods was incredibly slow, as his strength had been depleted by age. We pitched camp on the 5th day, reaching the spot where he had first encountered the mystery. He told me about a creature he called the Shatterpaw, a beast that had been watching him for years. I listened to his stories of werewolves and cryptids, assuming the tumor was affecting his mind. He described finding footprints that looked like a paw that had been violently shattered. Grandpa believed the beast was hunting him, sending messages directly into his failing brain. I felt like a lunatic for bringing a dying man into the wilderness to hunt a phantom. I decided to play along with his fantasy, stalking through the woods in a mock pursuit. I had secretly disabled his rifle to ensure he wouldn't accidentally hurt himself or me. A few hours later, he woke me up with a frantic shake, asking if I could smell the creature. He claimed the Shatterpaw gave off a stench that only a small portion of people could perceive. He rushed out of the tent into the darkness before I could say a single word of protest. I grabbed my own rifle and stepped outside to find that he had lit a massive bonfire. Grandpa looked me dead in the eyes and pulled a hidden handgun from his waistband. He told me he knew I had sabotaged his rifle and that I was actually the Shatterpaw. He demanded that I kill him to prove I wasn't the monster he feared. I threw my own gun to the ground, refusing to participate in his tragic delusion. I realized he wanted to die on his own terms and was trying to trick me into an act of mercy. He lowered the gun, looking ashamed of the elaborate trap he had set for us both. Suddenly, a sound from the brush caused him to snap the pistol back into a defensive position. He yelled for me to get down just as a tawny shadow lunged from the darkness. 3 quick cracks of the handgun echoed through the silent woods, followed by a heavy thud. A massive mountain lion lay dead in the dirt, shot perfectly between the eyes by an old man with failing hands. We spent 5 grueling days hiking back to town with the creature tied up in a sleeping bag. Grandpa lived long enough to see that cougar displayed prominently in my general store. He eventually passed away in his sleep, having faced his demons and protected the person he loved. To his dying day, he swore that the Shatterpaw was a real creature he had encountered decades ago. I could never find any evidence of such a cryptid, yet his conviction remained unshakable. Now, when I walk through the deep woods, I find myself sniffing the air for a stench I cannot name. Sometimes I wonder if the real monster was the one waiting for him at the end of a long, satisfying life. The shadows of the deep woods eventually faded into the cold, clinical hum of my downtown apartment. I found solace in the anonymity of the internet, a place where monsters were supposedly made of pixels and code. My routine involved debunking fringe theories and discussing the strange psychology of modern cults. I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to the Children of Eternal Clarity, a group following a man they called the Prophet. Their philosophy seemed like a standard mix of pseudoscience and aggressive self-help platitudes. I decided to leave a single, well-cited comment pointing out the logical fallacies in their latest recruitment video. I shut down my computer and went to bed, thinking nothing more of the interaction. The next morning, my phone was buzzing with an intensity that signaled something was wrong. I had over 400 notifications from the forum, all from accounts created within the last hour. The messages weren't just insults, they were detailed descriptions of my morning routine. I checked the forum thread and realized my comment had been pinned by the moderators. Underneath my critique, the Prophet himself had replied with a single phrase, "The eye sees the lie." I looked toward my window, wondering if someone was watching me from the building across the street. My personal email was flooded next, containing photos of my front door taken from the hallway. They had found my address, my phone number, and my social security digits in less than 12 hours. I called the police, but the officer on the line told me there was little they could do about internet trolls until a crime occurred. Then the food deliveries started arriving. Each one was paid for in my name using a credit card I hadn't used in 3 years. I spent the afternoon changing passwords and freezing my bank accounts while the doorbell rang every 20 minutes. By sunset, the forum was filled with live stream links from the children titled The Purification of Sarah. I clicked one link and saw a grainy video of my own apartment building from a car parked across the street. A figure in the car held up a sign with my phone number written in thick black marker. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, as if the air itself had become thick with the weight of being watched. Suddenly, my smart speaker turned on at full volume, playing a distorted recording of my own voice from the previous night. I shut down my computer and went to bed. My voice echoed, warped, and slowed down to a demonic crawl. I unplugged the speaker, but the audio continued to play from my television in the other room. I realized they hadn't just doxed me, they had hacked every internet-connected device in my home. A soft scratching sound began at the base of my bedroom window, which was 4 stories above the ground. I couldn't move as I watched a small black drone hover outside the glass, its camera lens red and unblinking. I grabbed a heavy book and threw it at the window, hoping to knock the machine out of the sky. The drone simply dipped out of sight, and then my phone screen lit up with a new text message. "Violence is a lie, Sarah. The prophet offers only truth." The message read. I heard the front door of my apartment creak open, followed by the heavy thud of multiple footsteps on the hardwood. They didn't need to break in, they had used the smart lock code I had never even activated. I crawled under my bed, pulling the dusty bedskirt down to hide myself from the intruder's view. Through the gap, I saw 2 pairs of pristine white sneakers enter my bedroom and stop just feet from my face. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of a finger against the wooden bed frame above me. Then, a familiar geometric iris symbol was slid across the floor, stopping inches from my hand. I felt the mattress above me sag as one of them sat down, and a voice whispered my name through the floorboards. I realized then that they weren't here to hurt me yet. They were here to show me that I was already theirs. As the tapping on the frame turned into a rhythmic scratching, I wondered how many others were watching this live. But the most terrifying part was the realization that my front door had just been locked from the outside. That suffocating sensation of being locked in, of having your entire world shrink to the size of a single room, was my entire childhood. Long before digital cults could hunt me from across the globe, I was already a prisoner in a farmhouse governed by a woman named Mama Charlene. She wasn't my biological mother, yet she demanded the title with a ferocity that made our real memories fade into static. The house we lived in was a sprawling, multi-story structure of peeling white paint and warped floorboards that groaned under any footfall. Mama Charlene always sat in a high-backed velvet chair that looked like a throne stolen from a funeral parlor. Her eyes were a pale, milky blue that seemed to see through our skin and into our very sins. She wore heavy wool dresses even in the sweltering heat of August, her silver hair pinned back so tight it pulled her scalp. Every morning at dawn, we were required to line up in the hallway and wait for her bedroom door to click open. We weren't allowed to speak until she had touched the top of our heads with her cold, bony palm. This was her blessing, a ritual that served only to remind us who held the power of life and death in that house. Love was never a word spoken in the farmhouse, replaced instead by the constant threat of her inexplicable decrees. She would wake up and announce that for the next week, the color green was an abomination to God. We would spend hours scrubbing the wallpaper or burning clothing just to appease her sudden nonsensical whims. If you were caught with even a blade of grass on your shoe, the punishment was the silence hour. The silence hour never lasted an hour. It lasted until Mama Charlene felt the demon of noise had left your soul. There were 12 of us children, none related by blood, but all bound by the same invisible chains of psychological terror. We slept in the attic on thin cots, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wood like the ghosts of those who had left before us. Mama Charlene told us the world outside the fence was a churning sea of fire and monsters waiting to consume the unfaithful. I remember seeing a mail truck drive past once, and I hid behind a tree, terrified that the driver would breathe fire on me. That was the depth of her control. She didn't need locks when she had built a prison inside our minds. The most terrifying decree came in the winter of my 14th year, the one she called the cleansing of the week. She gathered us in the parlor, the air so cold our breath came out in ragged white clouds. She stood before us, holding a heavy iron key that glinted in the dim light like a silver tooth. "One of you has allowed a shadow into this house," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper on wood. We all looked at each other, the same thought racing through our minds. Who would she choose to punish? She began to walk down the line, the iron key clicking against the wooden floorboards with every step. She stopped in front of a boy named Samuel, the youngest and quietest among us. Samuel had been coughing for weeks, a deep, wet sound that he tried desperately to hide in his pillow. Mama Charlene declared that his sickness was a physical manifestation of his secret disobedience. She ordered us to help her drag him toward the heavy, padlocked door at the end of the kitchen hallway. I was one of them. I held his left ankle as he cried out for a mother he had never known. The door led to a room we were never allowed to enter, a place we simply called the cold storage. As the key turned in the lock, a blast of air escaped that smelled of old copper and frozen earth. Samuel was shoved inside and the door was slammed shut before his first scream could even echo. Mama Charlene turned to us and smiled, an expression that was more a baring of teeth than a sign of joy. "The air will purify him," she said, before ordering us back to our chores as if nothing had happened. For 3 days we were forbidden from going near that end of the house, yet the silence from behind the door was louder than any scream. On the 4th morning, Mama Charlene didn't come out of her room for the blessing. We waited for hours, the hunger gnawing at our stomachs and the fear gnawing at our hearts. Finally, the oldest boy, David, gathered the courage to knock on her door, only to find it was already unlatched. The room was empty, her bed perfectly made, but on her pillow lay the heavy iron key to the cold storage. We ran to the basement, our footsteps thundering against the floorboards like a stampede of terrified animals. David fumbled with the locks, his hands shaking so violently that the metal clattered against the wood. When the door finally swung open, the room inside wasn't a storage closet at all, but a tunnel leading deep into the earth. Samuel was nowhere to be seen, but his small gray shoes were neatly placed at the mouth of the tunnel, and from the depths of that dark, damp hole we heard a sound that didn't belong to a child or a woman. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking noise, the exact same sound Mama Charlene's boots made on the parlor floor. That's when we realized Mama Charlene hadn't just been hiding from the world, she was preparing us for something waiting beneath it. But the clicking wasn't getting further away, it was rapidly ascending the tunnel toward us. Suddenly, the light bulb above the hallway shattered, leaving us in total darkness with the sound of a heavy door locking behind us. The sound of the heavy door locking behind us echoed through the pitch-black hallway as the last remnants of the cult's house faded into a traumatic memory. We ran until our lungs burned, finally emerging into the cool, biting air of the mountain pass just as the first light of dawn touched the peaks. Elias collapsed onto a mossy log, his breath coming in ragged gasps while I scanned the tree line for any sign of pursuit. We decided to push deeper into the Silver Creek wilderness, believing that the sheer vastness of the woods would hide us better than any city could. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and old earth, a peaceful contrast to the madness we had just escaped. By midday, the trail had all but disappeared, replaced by a carpet of ferns and jagged limestone outcroppings. I stopped abruptly when I spotted a figure standing perfectly still beside a massive, lightning-struck oak tree. The man was draped in a tattered, muddy ghillie suit that made him look like a shambling mound of forest debris. He didn't wave or acknowledge us, but his head turned with a slow, mechanical precision as we approached. Elias called out a greeting, his voice sounding thin and fragile against the immense silence of the valley. The stranger didn't respond, instead shifting his grip on a modern, high-powered bolt-action rifle equipped with a massive scope. We hurried past him, the hair on the back of my neck standing up as I felt his gaze burning into our spines. An hour later, Elias stopped to take a drink, but his hand froze as a sharp crack echoed through the canyon. The plastic bottle in his hand suddenly exploded in a spray of water and jagged shards. He dropped to his knees, staring in disbelief at the shredded remains of the container that had been inches from his face. I tackled him into the shelter of a large granite boulder just as a second shot whistled through the air where he had been standing. There was no follow-up shot, only a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on us. I realized then that the marksman wasn't trying to kill us yet. He was showing us exactly how much control he had. We crawled through the dirt, using the jagged rocks as cover as we tried to navigate toward a denser thicket of trees. A third shot rang out, not hitting us, but severing a thick pine branch that fell directly in our path with a thunderous crash. "He's hurting us." Elias hissed, his voice trembling with the realization that we were being steered like cattle. I peered through the gaps in the foliage, trying to catch the telltale glint of a lens or the unnatural shape of a barrel. The forest was a sea of gray and black, and the hunter was a ghost among the shadows. I decided to make a break for a shallow cave I saw in the distance, hoping the rock ceiling would provide true safety. We sprinted across the open ground, our feet pounding against the hard-packed earth as the wind whipped past our ears. A bullet struck the ground between my feet, kicking up a plume of dust that made me stumble and fall. Elias grabbed my arm and dragged me the remaining 10 feet into the mouth of the narrow cavern. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of wet stone, a damp sanctuary from the unseen predator outside. We sat in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the rhythmic dripping of water and the distant howl of the wind. Suddenly, a metallic clinking sound drifted from the cave entrance like a small object being dropped onto the rocks. I shone my light toward the sound and saw a neat pile of 5 spent shell casings sitting on a flat stone just inside the threshold. He had been right there, inches from us, and we hadn't heard a single sound. Elias grabbed a heavy rock, his knuckles white as he prepared to defend the entrance against the invisible intruder. A small handheld radio began to crackle from somewhere in the tall grass just outside the cave. A distorted, gravelly voice came through the speaker, reciting our full names and the address of the house we had just fled. The hunter wasn't just a random woodsman, he was connected to the very people we were trying to escape. He told us that we had exactly 1 hour to reach the old ranger station or the real hunt would begin. We scrambled out of the cave, our hearts hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. As we ran, I saw the faint, ghostly movement of the ghillie suit keeping pace with us on the ridge above. Just as we reached the clearing of the ranger station, a small red laser dot appeared on the center of Elias's chest and began to slowly rise toward his throat. The red laser dot on Elias's chest felt like a full stop to one nightmare, but the shadows of the world are never truly empty. As the echoes of the deep woods fade, we turn our gaze to a different kind of predator, one that hides behind the pulpit rather than the pines. In the humid summer of 1994, the small town of Oakhaven was a place of dying industries and desperate prayers. People there were looking for a miracle, or at least a reason to keep waking up in the morning. That was when the white canvas tent first appeared on the outskirts of the old fairgrounds. It was massive, a bleached bone-white structure that seemed to glow against the twilight sky. With the tent came Pastor Julian Vane, a man whose voice possessed the resonance of a cathedral bell. He didn't arrive with a convoy or fanfare, just a single black sedan and a trunk full of worn Bibles. His eyes were a piercing, unnatural blue that seemed to see straight through a person's skin to their very soul. Within a week, the nightly revivals were packed with hundreds of locals seeking salvation. The air inside the tent was always thick, smelling of ozone, sweat, and cheap perfume. Vane spoke of a great transition, a promise that the heavy burdens of this life could be shed like an old skin. He began to isolate a specific group of 12 individuals, all of whom had no living relatives or deep ties to the town. There was Sarah, a young widow who had lost everything in a house fire just months prior. There was Thomas, an elderly veteran who lived alone in a trailer and spoke to no one. Each of the 12 shared a common thread. They were essentially invisible to the rest of society. Vane called them his disciples of the threshold and held private sessions with them long after the main congregation left. A local boy once peeked through a tear in the canvas and saw the 12 sitting in a perfect circle, their heads bowed at an impossible angle. He claimed he heard a low, rhythmic humming that didn't sound human, vibrating the very ground beneath his feet. As the weeks passed, the 12 grew pale and gaunt, their eyes reflecting the same eerie light as the pastor's. Neighbors noticed that these individuals began selling their meager possessions or simply leaving their doors unlocked. On the final night of July, the heat was stifling, and the cicadas in the surrounding trees suddenly went silent. A late-night traveler reported seeing the white tent illuminated from within by a pulsing violet radiance. No music was heard that night, only the sound of a single, rhythmic drumbeat echoing across the valley. The next morning, the town woke up to find the fairgrounds completely empty. The massive white tent was gone, leaving only a perfectly circular patch of dead, blackened grass. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, and no signs of a large-scale pack-up operation. When the sheriff checked the homes of the 12 disciples, he found them all deserted. Dinner plates were still on tables with rotting food, and clothes were still hanging on lines to dry. It was as if they had simply stepped out of their lives and into thin air. Pastor Julian Vane's black sedan was found 3 miles away, abandoned in the middle of a bridge with the engine still idling. The keys were in the ignition, but there was no trace of the pastor or any of his followers. For 30 years, the case of the Oakhaven 12 remained the state's most baffling cold case. Skeptics suggested a mass cult suicide, but no bodies were ever recovered from the river or the woods. Others whispered about something more ancient, a ritual that required 12 souls to open a door that should stay shut. Recently, a hiker exploring a remote cavern 60 miles from Oakhaven stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Deep within the limestone tunnels, he found 12 sets of clothing laid out in a perfect circle on the stone floor. The clothes weren't tattered or decayed. They looked as fresh as the day they were last worn in 1994. Inside each pair of shoes there were no bones, only a fine silvery dust that felt cold to the touch. In the center of the circle lay the pastor's leather-bound Bible, its pages fluttering in a wind that shouldn't exist underground. When the hiker picked up the book, he realized the pages weren't filled with scripture, but with handwritten names of people from the next town over. As he turned to the final page, he saw his own name written in fresh, wet ink that was still glistening. A shadow began to stretch from the cave wall, taking the shape of a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat. The sound of a rhythmic drumbeat began to thrum through the hiker's very bones, growing louder with every heartbeat. From the darkness of the tunnel, a voice like a cathedral bell whispered, "You are late for the next revival." The echo of that cathedral voice still vibrated in the base of my skull as I stepped onto the salt-stained pavement of downtown Toronto. A freezing wind whipped through the concrete canyons, carrying the sharp scent of Lake Ontario and impending snow. My shift at the shipping warehouse had ended 2 hours late, leaving my muscles leaden and my mind frayed. The city felt unnaturally quiet, as if the buildings themselves were holding their breath while I passed. A low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to vibrate through the soles of my boots. I turned my head slightly and noticed a pair of dull, yellowish headlights approaching from a block away. The vehicle was moving at a walking pace, its engine growling with a mechanical cough that sounded like a dying beast. I instinctively quickened my pace, my heart beginning a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. The white van didn't speed up to pass me, but maintained the exact same distance as if tethered to my shadow. I crossed the street to the opposite sidewalk, hoping the move would force the driver to reveal his intent. The van's tires screeched against the cold road as it swerved sharply to follow me, cutting across the yellow lines. My walk turned into a jog, my boots slapping loudly against the frozen concrete. Behind me, I heard the heavy sliding door of the van being thrown open with a violent, metallic crash. 2 men in dark, bulky clothing leaped from the vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. I tried to sprint toward a well-lit porch, but a gloved hand caught the back of my parka, yanking me off balance. I spun around and swung my heavy messenger bag like a flail, feeling the laptop inside connect with a dull thud. The tall man let out a sharp grunt and stumbled backward into the side of the rusted van. I didn't wait to see if he was down. I turned and bolted into the narrow alleyway between 2 brick houses. The second man shouted something unintelligible, his heavy boots pounding the pavement in pursuit. I tripped over a discarded wooden pallet, the rough splinters tearing through my jeans and into my knee. I scrambled to my feet, the adrenaline masking the stinging pain as I saw a flashlight beam sweep the walls behind me. I climbed over a chain-link fence at the end of the alley, my fingers burning from the icy metal. On the other side, I landed hard in a patch of frozen mud and immediately ducked behind a row of industrial bins. I could hear the men talking in low, clipped tones on the other side of the fence. "He's trapped in the yard, just circle back and block the gate," one of them commanded with chilling calm. The realization hit me that they weren't random muggers. They were coordinated, professional, and patient. I looked around for an exit and saw a small, rusted metal door at the back of the building. I dashed for the door, my heart hammering so loud it felt like it would burst through my parka. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door was locked tight, mocking my attempt at escape. The sound of a heavy engine roared nearby as the white van pulled into the lot's entrance, blocking my only way out. I was caught in the beams like a deer, my shadow cast giant and distorted against the brick wall. The driver's door opened and a third man stepped out, holding a thick coil of heavy-duty zip ties. I scanned the ground and found a heavy iron pipe leaning against a stack of pallets. I gripped the cold metal with both hands, the weight of it giving me a sliver of hope in the darkness. The three men began to close in from different angles, their movements synchronized and predatory. "Just make it easy on yourself, kid, and nobody has to get hurt," the tall one said, his voice devoid of emotion. I noticed a small circular emblem on the sleeve of the driver's jacket that looked like a stylized eye. As the tall man lunged, I swung the pipe with a desperate scream, the metal whistling through the air. He cried out in pain as the pipe shattered his wrist, sending the zip ties flying into the slush. I didn't stop to admire my work. I dove between the other two men and scrambled toward the parking lot's retaining wall. Below the wall was a steep, icy embankment leading down to the railway tracks that ran through the city. I heard the van's engine roar again as they reversed to cut off my path along the ridge. With no other choice, I threw myself over the edge and began a bone-jarring slide down the frozen earth. I crashed through frozen shrubs and hit the gravel of the railbed with a force that knocked the wind from my lungs. I lay there for a moment, the world spinning, until I saw three silhouettes looking down at me from the top of the wall. One of them raised a long, thin object that caught the moonlight with a metallic glint. A sharp pop echoed through the ravine and a small, glowing dart hissed through the air inches from my head. They were using tranquilizers. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me compliant. I sprinted into the darkness of the nearby railway tunnel, my footsteps echoing like gunshots against the stone walls. As I ran, that same cathedral voice from my memories seemed to whisper from the damp walls, "The revival seeks its own." The air in the tunnel was thick with the smell of coal dust and ancient decay. I stopped to listen and heard the distant, rhythmic clanking of a train approaching from the other side. I turned back and saw the flashlight beams of the three men entering the tunnel entrance, scanning the floor for my tracks. I was caught between a freight train and three professional kidnappers in a lightless tomb. I felt along the damp wall for a maintenance alcove, my fingers screaming from the cold. The light from the train grew blindingly bright, and the ground began to shake with the fury of 1,000 hammers. I saw one of the men step onto the tracks, his silhouette framed by the roaring locomotive behind him. He didn't look like he was trying to catch me anymore. He looked like he was waiting for something to happen. As the train roared past, the man simply stepped into the wall as if it were made of water, and a new terrifying light began to bleed from the stones. I looked down at my own hands and saw my skin starting to shimmer with that same impossible golden glow. I stared down at my trembling hands as the impossible golden glow beneath my skin began to pulse in rhythm with my frantic heartbeat. I forced my fingers into tight fists and shoved them deep into the pockets of my overcoat, praying no one in the terminal had seen the light. The boarding call for Flight 402 to Tokyo crackled over the intercom like a lifeline thrown into a dark sea. I stood up and joined the queue, keeping my head down, and my collar turned up to hide the sweat beads forming on my neck. Walking through the pressurized cabin door felt like crossing a threshold into a world where my past could finally be forgotten. I found seat 24A and immediately huddled against the window, seeking the comfort of the cold plastic wall. I peeked under my sleeve one last time and saw the shimmer had subsided into a faint, sickly yellow bruise. The heavy thud of a carry-on bag hitting the floor beside me snapped my attention back to the aisle. A man of immense proportions stood in the aisle, his shadow stretching across my lap like a dark shroud. Without a word, he squeezed his massive frame into the seat next to mine, his shoulder pressing hard against my arm. He smelled of stale cigarettes and something metallic, a scent that made my stomach churn with a sudden, sharp nausea. The plane began its taxi, and the man started to drum his thick, scarred fingers on the armrest we shared. As we took off, the vibrations of the ascent caused the glow beneath my skin to flare up once again. I felt the man's gaze shift from the back of the seat in front of him directly to my covered wrist. "You're carrying something bright, aren't you, little bird?" he whispered in a voice like grinding stones. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as I realized he had seen the light despite my precautions. I tried to ignore him, turning my face toward the dark clouds passing outside the window. He didn't take the hint and instead slammed his elbow into my ribs, pinning me against the cabin wall. A sharp cry escaped my lips, but the roar of the engines drowned it out before anyone could hear. "Don't turn your back on me when I'm speaking to you," he hissed, his face inches from mine. I looked around for a flight attendant, but the fasten seatbelt sign was still illuminated and the aisle remained empty. The man began a low, rhythmic chanting, a series of guttural sounds that felt like they were vibrating inside my skull. Every time I tried to move or call for help, he would subtly dig his fingers into my thigh, the pressure bordering on bone breaking. Hours passed in this agonizing stalemate as the plane crossed the vast, dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean. He began to list details about my life, my address in Toronto, the name of my sister, the color of my front door. My blood ran cold as I realized this encounter wasn't a random coincidence, but a calculated hunt. He reached over and forcefully grabbed my wrist, pulling the sleeve back to expose the burning gold light to the open air. The skin where he touched me began to sizzle, a faint wisp of smoke rising between his fingers. He didn't flinch or let go. Instead, he laughed, a dry, rattling sound that filled the small space. I managed to kick his shin with all my might, creating just enough space to scramble out of my seat and into the aisle. I ran toward the back of the plane, my glowing arm acting like a beacon in the sleeping cabin. I locked myself inside the tiny lavatory, my chest heaving as I leaned against the cold metal door. In the mirror, I saw that the glow was no longer just on my wrists. It was spreading like a network of fiery veins across my neck. A sudden, heavy pound on the door made the entire plastic structure shudder. "Open the door, little bird, or I'll take the whole plane down to get to you." The man's voice boomed from the other side. I watched as the lock on the door began to glow red-hot, the metal softening under some unseen force. Outside the small window, the sky had turned an impossible shade of violet, and the stars seemed to be falling toward the earth. The plane took a sudden, violent dive, and the gravity shifted, throwing me against the ceiling. I heard the screams of the other passengers through the walls, a chorus of terror that matched the roar of the wind outside. The lavatory door finally gave way, and as it swung open, I saw the man standing there, his own eyes now glowing with that same terrible golden fire. While the golden-eyed man on that flight remains a haunting enigma, some terrors find us in the places we feel most secure. It was a Tuesday night in October when the silence of my bedroom first felt heavy and unnatural. I had just finished my book and reached over to turn off the bedside lamp for the night. The sudden click of the switch echoed in the stillness of the empty suburban house. I lay there for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the thick darkness of the room. A soft, rhythmic thudding sound drifted up from the floor directly below my room. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or the wind against the siding. But the sound was far too deliberate and heavy to be a mere trick of the autumn weather. My heart rate spiked as I heard the distinct creak of the back door being forced open. Without thinking, I rolled off the mattress and scrambled into the narrow space beneath my bed frame. The air under there was stale and smelled of old dust and forgotten storage boxes. I pressed my chest against the cold hardwood floor, trying to suppress my ragged, gasping breath. Heavy footsteps began to slowly ascend the stairs, each one vibrating through the floorboards against my cheek. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could simply disappear into the deep shadows of the carpet. The bedroom door, which I had left slightly ajar, groaned loudly as it was pushed wide open. From my restricted vantage point, I could see a pair of mud-caked combat boots enter the room. The intruder didn't move quickly. He paced the perimeter of my bed with a slow, predatory confidence. He stopped just inches from where my face was hidden, his heavy boots clicking against the wood. I caught the faint metallic scent of rain and motor oil clinging to his heavy clothes. He leaned down suddenly, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to look under the frame. Instead, I heard the springs of the mattress groan as he sat down directly above me. The sheer weight of him caused the wooden slats to press down uncomfortably close to my head. I could hear him breathing, a slow, wet rasp that suggested he was truly enjoying the intrusion. My hand brushed against a stray dust bunny, and I had to bite my lip to keep from sneezing. He began to hum a low, tuneless melody that made every hair on my arm stand up in terror. Minutes felt like hours as I remained paralyzed, watching the dark shadows of his feet shift on the floor. Eventually, the weight lifted from the bed, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a drawer being opened. He was rummaging through my vanity, tossing my personal belongings onto the floor one by one. The sound of my favorite jewelry box shattering against the wall made me jump internally with silent rage. There was a sudden, sharp clicking sound like a plastic cap being removed from a container. I watched as his boots moved toward the large, ornate vanity mirror on the opposite wall. A squeaking, waxy sound filled the quiet room, like someone writing heavily on glass with a crayon. He spent several minutes there, his deliberate arm movements visible through the gap in the bedskirt. Once he was finished, he stood back to admire his work, laughing softly and chillingly to himself. The low chuckle was deep and devoid of any real mirth or humanity, vibrating through my chest. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving the heavy bedroom door wide open. I stayed under the bed for what felt like an eternity, listening for any possible sign of his return. My muscles were cramping painfully, but the primal fear kept me anchored firmly to the floor. When I finally heard the back door slam shut downstairs, I waited another 10 minutes before crawling out. My legs felt like jelly as I stood up and looked toward the wreckage of my vanity. In the dim moonlight, I could see bright red streaks covering the entire surface of the mirror. He had used my favorite red lipstick to scrawl a message in jagged, oversized letters. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the words that seemed to shimmer with a terrifying life of their own. The message read, "I know you're still under there, Sarah." Just as the realization hit, I felt a blast of cold air from the hallway and heard the floorboards behind me creak once more. The cold air from the hallway in that previous story still haunts the mind, but some horrors prefer the open water over a locked room. For Leo, the family cruise was meant to be a grand escape from the mundane reality of high school. The oceanic crest was a behemoth of steel, a floating city designed to keep the darkness of the sea at bay with neon and champagne. While his parents toasted to their success in the grand ballroom, Leo sought the solace of the lower decks, where the music was just a dull thud. On the third night of the voyage, he found himself wandering near the restricted engineering sections. It was there, amidst the rhythmic pounding of the engines, that he first saw the man in the white shirt. The man didn't look like the other crew members. His uniform was rumpled, and his eyes were far too bright. "You're not supposed to be down here, kid," the man said, his voice smooth and surprisingly warm. Leo stammered an apology, his heart beginning to race in the sudden silence of the corridor. The stranger chuckled and introduced himself as Elias, claiming he worked in internal security for the cruise line. He told Leo that the ship had secret passages and hidden rooms that the regular tourists would never see. For a lonely teenager, the promise of an exclusive adventure was an irresistible lure. Elias began to share stories of the stowaways, people who lived in the belly of the ship for months without being caught. He described how they moved through the vents, stealing food and watching the passengers from the shadows. As they walked deeper into the ship, the temperature began to drop and the air grew thick with the smell of brine. Elias's tone shifted, becoming more intimate and conspiratorial, as if he and Leo were the only two real people on board. "The people upstairs are just cattle," Elias whispered, his eyes locked onto Leo's with an uncomfortable intensity. Leo felt a sudden urge to turn back, but Elias's hand was already on his shoulder, guiding him forward. They reached a heavy iron door that led out to a small, secluded observation platform near the stern. The platform was forgotten by the crew, rusted and slick with the spray of the churning Atlantic below. The wind howled through the railings, drowning out the distant sounds of the ship's party. Elias followed him out, his face now devoid of the friendly mask he had worn earlier. "Have you ever wondered how long someone could survive in that water?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible over the gale. Leo's stomach did a slow roll, realizing he was completely alone with a man who didn't exist on any crew roster. He tried to push past Elias to get back inside, but the man didn't move an inch. "I'm not a security guard, Leo," Elias said, his smile widening into something predatory and sharp. "I'm just a man who found a way to stay on this ship forever, and I get very bored." Leo backed away, his heels hitting the lower rail as the freezing spray soaked his hoodie. Elias stepped into the boy's personal space, his height looming over the smaller teenager. "The water is 38 degrees tonight, Leo. Your heart would stop in less than 5 minutes." Leo began to scream for help, but the roar of the engines and the wind swallowed his voice completely. Elias laughed, a sound that was dry and hollow like dead leaves skittering on pavement. He grabbed Leo by the front of his hoodie, lifting the boy onto the balls of his feet. "Do you want to know what it feels like to be truly unseen?" the stowaway hissed. Leo felt his center of gravity shift as he was pushed further back over the railing. His hands clawed at Elias's arms, but the man's grip was like iron bands. He thought of his parents just a few decks above, oblivious to the murder happening right beneath them. Elias gave a sudden, sharp shove, and the boy's upper body tilted into the empty air. Only Leo's desperate grip on the rusted vertical bar kept him from falling into the dark wake. The stowaway leaned over him, looking down with a face that held no mercy, only a deep, abiding curiosity. Elias began to slowly pry Leo's fingers off the bar, one by one, with a calm deliberation that was worse than the violence. "Goodbye, Leo," he whispered, the sound carried away by the wind even as it chilled the boy to his core. With a final, agonizing effort, Leo felt his last finger slip from the cold, wet metal. Gravity claimed him, and he felt the sickening drop as he plunged toward the churning abyss. Just as the freezing water was about to swallow him whole, a blinding white light cut through the darkness of the stern. Marcus stepped into the warm, yellow light of the interior, nodding silently to the stoic driver. He was safe, but the shadow of the stowaway would haunt his dreams for years to come. Our final descent tonight takes us away from the open sea and into the damp, suffocating streets of London. Marcus stood alone at the bus stop, the cold rain seeping through his thin trench coat. He checked his watch for the 10th time, wondering if the midnight route was running late again. Finally, the twin beams of a double-decker bus cut through the mist, illuminating the swirling fog.